Welcome to Empathy Stories, where we shine a light on the struggles and triumphs that define the human spirit. Today's story takes us into the life of Dr. Olivia Carter, a brilliant heart surgeon whose encounter with a prejudiced bus driver leads to an unforgettable journey for justice. Stay tuned for a tale of resilience and courage. The air was crisp that morning in downtown Chicago, the type of chill that hinted at the approach of winter. Dr. Olivia Carter wrapped her coat tighter around herself as she stood at the bus stop, waiting for her usual ride to Chicago General Hospital. It was an ordinary day, or at least it should have been. Olivia was a woman of many accomplishments. At 38, she was one of the city's most skilled heart surgeons, a role she had worked tirelessly to achieve. Her name was synonymous with precision and calm under pressure, her hands having saved countless lives. But outside the hospital walls, the respect she garnered for her expertise often evaporated, leaving her to navigate the daily, insidious barriers that came with being a Black woman in America. Her morning had started like any other. She glanced at her watch. She was running a bit behind schedule, but it wasn't anything she couldn't manage. The hospital was only a few bus stops away. As the bus approached, Olivia felt a wave of relief. It was nearly empty. A small blessing after many nights of restless sleep, with a mental checklist of surgeries to prepare for. She was eager to settle into her seat and collect her thoughts before facing another demanding day. The bus hissed to a halt, and the doors slid open. Olivia stepped forward, ready to board, but the driver didn't move. He was a middle-aged white man with a hard, cold expression. His gaze swept over her, lingering in a way that made her feel unwelcome, as though she were intruding on his space. "You can't get on this bus," he said, his tone sharp and loaded with disdain. Olivia froze, her mind struggling to process what she'd just heard. "Excuse me," she asked, keeping her voice calm, her professional demeanor intact. Perhaps this was some misunderstanding. "I said, you're not getting on this bus?" the driver repeated, louder this time. His words carried venom, making it clear that this was no simple error. For a moment, Olivia could only blink at him, disbelief and confusion wrestling in her mind. This was public transportation, anyone could ride. Why was she being denied? She thought about the patients awaiting her at the hospital, the surgeries scheduled, and how her hands might be the difference between life and death for someone today. "I need to get to work," she said firmly, trying to keep her voice steady. "I don't care where you need to go," the driver snapped. "You're not getting on." The hostility in his tone and the sneer on his face made it clear this wasn't about a rule or policy. It was personal. Olivia's heart began to pound, anger rising in her chest. She had dealt with microaggressions and subtle discrimination throughout her career. But this was different. This was blatant, cruel, and public. "This is discrimination," Olivia said, her voice firm but rising slightly. "You have no right to refuse me service." The bus driver leaned closer, his face contorted with rage. "Take the next one," he said, his voice dripping with authority, as if he believed he had every right to decide who belonged and who didn't. Passengers on the bus stirred but remained silent. Olivia glanced at them, searching for an ally, but their faces were blank. Some turned away, unwilling to meet her eyes. Others seemed curious but unmoved, content to watch the scene unfold like spectators at a play. Before she could say another word, the driver stormed out of his seat. His movements were sudden, violent. Olivia barely had time to react before his hands shoved her back with force. She stumbled, her body hitting the cold pavement hard. Pain shot through her side as the air was knocked out of her lungs. The world spun for a moment as she lay there, gasping for breath. The driver loomed over her, his face twisted with hatred. "You people think you can do whatever you want," he hissed, his voice filled with venom. "Not today." Olivia's mind raced. She had done nothing to provoke him, nothing to deserve this attack. She was simply trying to get to work, yet here she was, lying on the pavement, humiliated and in pain. The driver's boot connected with her ribs, sending another sharp jolt of pain through her body. The passengers remained silent. Their apathy was deafening, their stillness more hurtful than the blows she was enduring. Tears welled in Olivia's eyes, not from the physical pain, but from the sheer helplessness of the moment. When the assault finally stopped, the driver spat on the ground near her, walked back to his seat, and drove away. Olivia lay on the pavement, staring up at the gray morning sky. The city moved around her, indifferent. Cars honked, pedestrians walked by, and life continued as though nothing had happened. But something had happened. This wasn't just an attack on Olivia's body. It was an attack on her humanity. As she slowly pushed herself to her feet, her ribs aching and her spirit battered, one thing became clear. This fight wasn't over. It was only just beginning. Olivia stood motionless on the sidewalk, her ribs aching and her thoughts spinning. Around her, the city carried on, indifferent to her pain. People passed by, sparing only fleeting glances. But no one stopped. No one asked if she was okay. The apathy stung almost as much as the driver's blows. For several long moments, Olivia simply stood there, trying to gather her strength, trying to make sense of what had just happened. She wiped a tear from her cheek, her hand trembling. Her once pristine coat was now dirty and torn, and her entire body felt like one large bruise. But what ached more was the humiliation. A successful doctor, a profesional, and yet reduced to this, cast aside like she was nothing. She had dedicated her life to saving others. But in that moment, she felt invisible. The hospital wasn't far. It was only a few blocks away. But the distance seemed impossible. Every step was a battle, her ribs protesting with each breath. But she pressed on. She had patience to think about, lives to save. Her own pain would have to wait. As she walked, Olivia replayed the driver's words in her mind, the venom in his voice echoing like a haunting refrain. You people. Two simple words that carried centuries of weight, reducing her entire existence to the color of her skin. No matter her accomplishments, no matter how hard she worked, there would always be people who saw her as less. The thought sent a fresh wave of anger coursing through her veins. But it was quickly replaced by a crushing sadness. When Olivia finally reached the hospital, the automatic glass doors slid open with a soft whoosh, revealing the familiar sterile world within. This was supposed to be her sanctuary, the place where her skill and expertise mattered more than anything else. Yet, as she stepped inside, she felt fragile, as if the confidence she wore so well had been stripped away. Her colleagues bustled about, oblivious to her arrival. Nurses hurried between patients. Doctors discussed cases in hushed tones, and the hum of medical equipment filled the air. Olivia forced herself to stand tall, hiding the pain etched across her face. She wasn't ready for questions or pity. She wasn't ready to explain why she was late or why her clothes looked disheveled. She just wanted to disappear into her work. She made her way to the locker room, her steps careful and deliberate. Once inside, she collapsed onto a bench, burying her face in her hands. For the first time since the attack, the emotion she had been holding at bay came crashing down. Tears streamed down her face, hot and relentless. She had spent her life proving her worth, fighting against the stereotypes and barriers that came with being a black woman in a predominantly white field. But today, it felt as though none of it mattered. Today, she was just another target for someone's hatred. The anger she had suppressed since the attack began to bubble up, hot and consuming. Why didn't anyone help me? She thought bitterly. The passengers on the bus had seen everything, yet they had done nothing. Their silence was as loud as the driver's shouts, as violent as his kicks. She thought about the bystanders who passed her on the street without stopping. Why didn't they care? The question gnawed at her, leaving a hollow ache in its wake. It wasn't just the driver who had failed her. It was everyone. The realization was almost too much to bear. Olivia took a deep breath, trying to regain her composure. She had surgeries to perform, lives depending on her. This wasn't the time to fall apart. She wiped her tears and changed into her scrubs, every movement sending sharp pangs of pain through her ribs. Her body protested, but she pushed forward. She had no choice. The hours that followed were grueling. In the operating room, Olivia's focus was razor-sharp. Her hands moved with precision, her mind fully engaged in the task at hand. It was the only way she knew how to cope, with each life she saved. She felt a small piece of herself return. But even in the sterile confines of the hospital, the events of that morning lingered in the back of her mind, casting a shadow over her every move. That evening, as Olivia sat alone in her apartment, the weight of the day pressed down on her. The physical pain was manageable, but the emotional wounds were raw and unrelenting. She stared at her phone, her lawyer's number displayed on the screen. He had called earlier, urging her to take action, but she hadn't answered. Part of her wanted to press charges, to fight back against the injustice she had faced. But another part of her was filled with doubt. Would anyone believe her? Would the system even care? She had seen it fail too many times before. Black women like her were so often silenced, their experiences dismissed or minimized. The thought made her hesitate. What if pressing charges led to nothing? What if she became just another statistic? But as she sat there, the memory of the driver's face flashed in her mind, his smug expression, the venom in his voice. She thought about the passengers who had remained silent, the way they had turned their backs on her suffering. This can't happen again, she thought. Not to me, not to anyone else. With trembling hands, Olivia picked up her phone and called her lawyer back. When he answered, she spoke with a resolve she hadn't felt in days. "I'm ready," she said firmly. "Let's press charges." And with those words, Olivia began a journey that would test her strength in ways she had never imagined. The fight for justice wouldn't be easy, but she was determined to see it through. Because this wasn't just about her anymore. It was about standing up to the hatred and violence that too many people like her had endured for far too long. The decision to press charges felt monumental. Yet as Olivia hung up the phone, a wave of apprehension washed over her. She had taken the first step in a battle she knew would be long and grueling. Her lawyer, Jonathan Pierce, was quick to act, scheduling an initial consultation to go over the details of the case. 2 days later, Olivia sat in his modest downtown office. The room was filled with neatly organized files and law books, the faint smell of coffee lingering in the air. Jonathan, a sharp but empathetic man in his early 40s, leaned forward, his pen poised over a notepad. "Dr. Carter," he began, his voice calm but firm, "you're making the right choice. What happened to you was unacceptable, and we're going to hold that driver accountable. But I won't lie to you. This is going to be a fight." Olivia nodded, her hands folded tightly in her lap. "I understand," she replied, though her voice wavered slightly. Jonathan studied her for a moment before continuing. "The key to this case will be evidence. Your testimony will be critical, but we need to corroborate it. Were there cameras on the bus? Any witnesses who could back you up?" Olivia's heart sank. The passengers had all remained silent, and she doubted any of them would come forward now. "I don't know," she admitted. "No one said anything. They just watched." Jonathan's expression darkened. "That's common. Unfortunately, people are afraid to get involved, or they convince themselves it's not their problem. But we'll work with what we have. The injuries you sustained, the hospital records, they'll support your story. And if there were any cameras on that bus, we'll get the footage." Olivia nodded again, but doubt crept into her mind. The silence of the witnesses haunted her. If no one else was willing to speak up, would her word be enough? Over the next few weeks, Olivia's life became a whirlwind of meetings, statements, and legal proceedings. Jonathan was thorough, filing the charges and preparing her for what lay ahead. Still, each step of the process felt like walking through quicksand. Every detail she recounted brought back the pain and humiliation of that day, and the uncertainty of the outcome weighed heavily on her. The case quickly caught the attention of the local media. Headlines about a prominent black doctor being attacked by a bus driver spread, sparking outrage in some circles and skepticism in others. Olivia tried to ignore the noise, but it was impossible to block out completely. Some articles framed her as a victim bravely standing up against injustice, while others questioned her motives, suggesting she might be exaggerating the incident for attention. The latter stung the most. She had spent her entire life proving her worth, overcoming countless barriers to achieve her position. Now, she was being painted as someone seeking to exploit the system. One evening, after a particularly draining day at work, Olivia sat on her couch scrolling through social media. The comment section of a news article about her case was a cesspool of vitriol. Another entitled woman looking for a payday. She's just playing the race card. Why didn't anyone else on the bus back her up? Sounds fishy to me. Olivia slammed her phone down, her chest tightening with anger and frustration. It didn't matter how successful she was, how much good she had done in the world. There would always be people who saw her as less. Her phone buzzed, breaking her spiral of thoughts. It was a message from Jonathan. Got a lead on potential footage from the bus. Stay strong. We're making progress. Progress. The word felt like a lifeline, something to cling to amidst the storm. The pretrial hearings began on a gray morning, the kind of day that seemed to mirror Olivia's mood. The courtroom was smaller than she expected, its wooden benches worn from years of use. Jonathan sat beside her, his presence a steadying force. Across the room sat the bus driver, his expression smug and dismissive. He didn't seem nervous. If anything, he looked bored, as though the entire proceeding were an inconvenience. When the judge entered, the room fell silent, the weight of the moment settling over everyone. The charges were read aloud, assault and battery, and the bus driver pleaded not guilty. His lawyer, a sharp-looking man with a calculated air, wasted no time laying out his strategy. This case is about a misunderstanding, he said smoothly. My client, a hardworking man, was simply doing his job. What we have here is a situation that escalated unnecessarily, fueled by emotions and miscommunication. Olivia's stomach turned. Miscommunication? The memory of the driver's sneer, his venomous words, his kicks, all of it was burned into her mind. There was no miscommunication. This was hate. The bus driver's lawyer continued, casting doubt on Olivia's account. He pointed out the lack of witnesses willing to come forward, suggesting that if the incident had been as severe as she claimed, surely someone would have spoken up. Jonathan countered expertly, presenting the evidence they had so far, her injuries, the hospital records, and a preliminary report indicating the possibility of security footage from the bus. But as the hearing went on, Olivia couldn't shake the feeling that the system was working against her. By the end of the day, she was emotionally drained. The bus driver's lawyer had planted seeds of doubt, and Olivia worried they might take root. That night, she lay awake, staring at the ceiling. Her mind replayed every moment of the attack, every word the driver had spat at her, every blank stare from the passengers. She thought about the countless other black women who had faced similar injustices, their voices drowned out by a system that refused to listen. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about all of them. The next morning, as Olivia prepared for another day in court, a thought took root in her mind, a quiet, determined resolution. If the witnesses wouldn't speak, then she would, loudly, clearly, for everyone to hear. Because silence, she realized, was the greatest weapon of all, and she would not let it win. The courtroom was colder the next morning, or perhaps Olivia just felt the chill more deeply. She took her seat beside Jonathan, her posture straight, her resolve firm. Today, she would testify. She would finally speak her truth, no matter how painful it was to relive that morning. Jonathan gave her a reassuring nod as the proceedings began. The bus driver sat across the room, his expression unreadable, but his body language relaxed, as if he believed the outcome was already in his favor. His lawyer shuffled papers, the air of confidence radiating off him like a shield. The judge called Olivia to the stand, and she rose slowly, every step deliberate as she approached. The courtroom seemed to shrink as she sat down, the weight of every eye on her pressing heavily against her chest. Please state your name and occupation for the record, Jonathan said, standing before her. Dr. Olivia Carter, she replied, her voice steady despite the nervous flutter in her stomach. I'm a heart surgeon at Chicago General Hospital. Jonathan smiled briefly, then began his questions. Dr. Carter, can you recount for the court what happened on the morning of the incident? Olivia took a deep breath. Her mind flashed back to the bus stop, to the sharpness of the driver's voice, the sting of the pavement against her body. She had rehearsed this moment with Jonathan, but nothing could have prepared her for the rawness of speaking it aloud. "I was on my way to work," she began, her voice clear but soft. "I was running a little late, so I was relieved when the bus arrived. But when I stepped forward to board, the driver stopped me." Her throat tightened, but she forced herself to continue. "He told me I couldn't get on the bus. When I asked why, he refused to answer. I tried to reason with him, but he just got angrier. Then he came out of his seat and shoved me to the ground. He kicked me, more than once." Her voice cracked slightly at the memory, but she straightened her back, refusing to let it break her. "He said things I can't forget. You people, he called me, as if my very existence was offensive to him." Jonathan nodded, his expression one of quiet encouragement. "And how did the passengers on the bus respond?" Olivia hesitated, the familiar ache of disappointment rising in her chest. "They didn't," she said simply. "They just sat there, watching. Not a single person spoke up or tried to help." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Olivia felt the sting of those silent stares all over again. But she held her head high. Jonathan continued, carefully guiding her through the rest of her testimony. She recounted every detail she could remember: the driver's words, the violence, the helplessness she felt lying on the cold pavement. By the time she finished, the courtroom was silent, the weight of her story hanging heavy in the air. Then came the defense's turn. The bus driver's lawyer approached with a slow, deliberate stride, his expression calm but predatory. Olivia braced herself. "Dr. Carter," he began, his tone dripping with condescension. "You claim the driver attacked you without provocation. Is that correct?" "Yes," Olivia said firmly. "And yet, no one has come forward to corroborate your story," he continued, pacing slightly. "Not a single passenger on the bus has backed your account. Isn't that strange?" Olivia's jaw tightened. She had anticipated this line of questioning, but it didn't make it any easier to hear. "I can't speak for the passengers," she said, her voice steady but edged with frustration. "I don't know why they've chosen to stay silent, but that doesn't change what happened." The lawyer raised an eyebrow, feigning skepticism. "Or perhaps it didn't happen the way you're describing," he said smoothly. "Isn't it possible that you misinterpreted the driver's actions? That in the heat of the moment, emotions ran high, and things escalated unnecessarily?" "No," Olivia said sharply, her voice cutting through the courtroom. "I didn't misinterpret anything. He attacked me. I did nothing to provoke him." The lawyer smirked slightly, as if satisfied with her response. He turned to the jury, his voice calm but persuasive. "Ladies and gentlemen, what we have here is a classic case of he said, she said. No witnesses, no video footage, no hard evidence, just the word of one person against another." Olivia's hands clenched tightly in her lap. She wanted to scream, to shout that this wasn't just her word. Her bruises, her hospital records, they told the story too. But in that moment, the defense attorney's words seemed to hang in the air like a thick fog, clouding the truth. When the day's proceedings ended, Olivia left the courtroom feeling drained. She had spoken her truth, but doubt lingered. Had the jury believed her? Or had the defense's narrative swayed them? She walked through the courthouse halls, her mind racing. The silence of the witnesses loomed large, their absence a constant reminder of how often people chose apathy over action. But just as she reached the exit, something unexpected happened. "Excuse me," a voice called. Olivia turned to see a man approaching. He was middle-aged, his hair streaked with gray, his expression nervous but determined. I need to speak with you," he said, his voice trembling slightly. "I was on the bus that day. I saw what happened." Olivia froze, her breath catching in her throat. "You were there?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The man nodded, guilt etched across his face. "I've been too afraid to come forward, but after hearing you testify, I can't stay silent anymore." For a moment, Olivia could only stare at him, a mix of disbelief and relief washing over her. Someone had finally broken the silence. Someone had seen the truth and chosen to speak up. That night, as Olivia sat alone in her apartment, she replayed the man's words in her mind. His decision to come forward felt like a crack in the wall of indifference she had been fighting against. For the first time since the attack, a small glimmer of hope flickered within her. The fight wasn't over, but she wasn't alone anymore. The next morning, Olivia arrived at the courthouse with a renewed sense of purpose. The man who had approached her the previous day, George Harris, was now set to testify. His courage to come forward marked a critical shift in her case. And for the first time, Olivia felt the weight of isolation begin to lift. She still bore the emotional scars of that brutal morning, but knowing someone was willing to back her truth gave her strength. As the proceedings resumed, George took the stand. He was visibly nervous, his hands trembling as he adjusted the microphone. Olivia watched from her seat, her heart pounding. This was the moment she had been waiting for. "Please state your name for the court." Jonathan began. "George Harris," he said, his voice shaky but determined. "And can you tell us where you were on the morning of the incident involving Dr. Carter?" "George know that. I was on the bus," he replied. "I saw the whole thing." A ripple of surprise passed through the courtroom. Even the bus driver, who had maintained a smug demeanor throughout the trial, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Jonathan's tone was steady as he continued. "Mr. Harris, can you describe what you witnessed that day?" George glanced briefly at Olivia, then took a deep breath. "The driver wouldn't let her on the bus," he began. "I remember how angry he looked, how he sneered at her like she didn't belong there. When she tried to reason with him, he got out of his seat and shoved her. She fell to the ground, and he kicked her." George's voice faltered, emotion creeping into his words. "It was brutal, and no one did anything. I didn't do anything." Olivia felt tears prick her eyes as George continued. His testimony was raw, filled with the regret of his silence. "I was scared," he admitted. "I didn't know what to do. But hearing her speak, seeing her fight back, I couldn't stay silent anymore. She deserves justice." Jonathan allowed George's words to hang in the air for a moment before speaking. "Thank you, Mr. Harris. No further questions." The defense attorney stood, his expression tight as he approached George. "Mr. Harris," he began, his tone sharp. "It's been weeks since the incident. Are you certain your memory is accurate?" George straightened slightly. "Yes," he said firmly. "I'll never forget what I saw." Despite the defense's attempts to discredit him, George remained steadfast. His testimony, combined with Olivia's, painted a vivid picture of the driver's actions that day, and George's bravery seemed to inspire others. Over the next few days, 2 more passengers came forward, their accounts aligning with Olivia's. The narrative the defense had tried so hard to construct began to crumble. Conclusion: a victory with weight. On the final day of the trial, the courtroom was packed. The air was thick with anticipation as the judge prepared to deliver the verdict. Olivia sat beside Jonathan, her hands clenched tightly in her lap. She felt every second stretch into eternity. "The court finds the defendant guilty of assault and battery," the judge declared. The words hit Olivia like a wave. Relief, vindication, and exhaustion all swirled within her. She glanced at the bus driver, whose smugness had vanished, replaced by a pale, stunned expression. He would face consequences for his actions, but no punishment could erase the pain he had inflicted on her. As the courtroom emptied, Jonathan turned to her with a small smile. "You did it," he said quietly. Olivia nodded, but her emotions were conflicted. Yes, justice had been served, but the scars of that morning remained. The victory felt both triumphant and hollow. She had won her case, but the reality of systemic racism and indifference still loomed large. Epilogue: a new chapter. In the weeks that followed, Olivia began to piece her life back together. Returning to her routine wasn't easy. Every bus stop, every passing glance, felt like a reminder of what she had endured. But Olivia was no longer the same woman who had been beaten down on that cold pavement. She was stronger now, her voice louder. One evening, as she walked home from the hospital, Olivia passed the bus stop where it had all begun. She paused, staring at the spot where she had fallen. For a moment, the memories threatened to overwhelm her. But she took a deep breath and stood tall. This place wasn't just a site of pain anymore. It was where her fight had begun. As she continued walking, she noticed a young girl hesitating near the same bus stop. The girl clutched her bag tightly, her posture tense. Olivia recognized the fear in her eyes, the way she tried to make herself small, invisible. Without hesitation, Olivia approached her. "Are you all right?" she asked gently. The girl looked up, startled. "I'm fine," she replied, but her voice betrayed her unease. "You don't have to be afraid," Olivia said, her tone firm but kind. "Whatever it is, you're not alone." The girl hesitated, then began to speak in halting sentences about a bus driver who had made her feel unwelcome. The silent stares of passengers who offered no support. Olivia listened intently, her own experience echoing in the girl's story. "You've been there," Olivia said when the girl finished. "It's hard, but you have to stand up for yourself. You deserve to be treated with respect." The girl's eyes widened. "How do you do it?" she asked. "How do you stay strong?" Olivia smiled softly, her gaze steady. "You don't find strength all at once," she said. "You build it, piece by piece. And sometimes, you borrow it from others until you can stand on your own." As the bus approached, Olivia made a decision. "I'll ride with you," she said, stepping beside the girl. "You don't have to do this alone." Together, they boarded the bus. Olivia felt the familiar tension in the driver's gaze. But this time, she met it head-on. She had faced worse and survived. Now, she was stronger, not just for herself, but for others who needed someone to show them the way. As the city lights blurred past the windows, Olivia realized her fight wasn't over. But it was no longer a solitary battle. She had won her case, reclaimed her dignity, and found her voice. Now, she would use it to make a difference for the girl beside her, for others like her, and for a world still in need of change. Thank you for watching this powerful episode of Empathy Stories. Dr. Olivia Carter's journey reminds us that standing up against prejudice can spark change, even when the odds seem insurmountable. If her story moved you, please like, share, and subscribe to help amplify voices of strength and hope. Together, we can inspire empathy and action in a world that needs it more than ever.